Good afternoon. We're excited to have everybody back on campus together for the first time today. Hopefully, you will find all the additional in-person time as beneficial as we think it'll be. As we do have twice the number of people on campus each day, it's going to be extra important that we continue to follow our health and safety protocols. Keep your mask on, continue to socially distance, and be sure to wash your hands. And I know it can be difficult to forget and we bunch together, but if we do what we need to do, we only put ourselves in a much better position to return to a more normal environment sooner than later, which I know we all want to do. Today, our community time will focus on the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits denying the right to vote on the basis of sex. This August marked the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the amendment. As last Thursday was consultation day, it only made sense to give some time today to this important milestone in our nation's history. Rather than have me or a member of our faculty lecture about the amendment or the women's suffrage movement that led to its passage, we will hear from some of your fellow students who have been working and studying this amendment in Mrs. Lawson's U.S. history class. Their work is a great example of the type of powerful teaching and learning that we've still been able to engage in, even with our level 3 start to the year. I appreciate their willingness to share their contributions to their class with us today, and I turn it over to Mrs. Lawson.
Today, the fact that women, as well as men in the United States, can vote isn't controversial. It's only been that way for about 100 years. 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment was ratified, affirming women's constitutional right to vote. So what changed? What happened 100 years ago that made public opinion shift so dramatically? Because prior to the passage of the amendment, it wasn't a topic that people hadn't thought about at all before, and it wasn't one people were indifferent to. In fact, it was one they had pretty strong opinions about. So with that anniversary in mind, we decided in U.S. history to investigate and to see especially how public opinion changed, because getting a constitutional amendment passed is not easy. You need really strong majorities of the population to support that change. Along with voting rights, we also looked at some other ways that the meaning of citizenship in the United States was different for men and women. After we looked at some resources together, students in U.S. history were free to dig a little deeper into some particular aspect of what they learned that was particularly interesting, and then to create either a video or a work of art that showed or talked about what they had learned. I hope you enjoy these students' work. This is just a sample of what we did last week in U.S. history.
Women have been fighting for the right to vote since 1848, but the 19th Amendment wasn't passed in all 50 states until 1984. Basically, suffragists wanted the right of citizens of the United States to vote to not be denied because of gender. What surprised me most about their long journey is how the suffragists were treated. One example is the Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913, which was the first major national event for the movement. Crowds of men were blocking the parade's path, and the men were yelling degrading phrases to the women. The police would actually join in on the jokes instead of helping. Many women were tripped, jostled, and violently attacked, and over 100 women in the suffrage parade were hospitalized for injuries. Another example of how the suffragists were treated is the Night of Terror. Occoquan is the name of the prison 33 women were taken after getting arrested for picketing outside the White House in 1917. Here they experienced torture from guards, such as being force-fed and being knocked out from a guard throwing you so hard into a cell. There were also some women, along with men, who were anti-suffragists. These groups of people believed that women already had the right to freedom within the home. Anti-suffragists delayed women's suffrage for decades. Because of these groups, suffrage was seen as being against tradition and family. Many women supported this movement because they didn't want to stray away from home life in fear of feminism causing them stress, anxiety, and depression. Men supported the anti-suffragists because they didn't believe women had the time or mental capacity to understand politics, causing more harm to society and culture. Suffragists had many things going against them. They were degraded and treated extremely bad by police, prison guards, men, and much more. They also had to deal with an entire movement created just to keep women from gaining the right to vote. Despite these things, women were slowly began gaining the right to vote state by state. This started with the territory of Wyoming in 1869 and ended with the state of Mississippi in 1984, over 100 years later.
The main thing that I learned from studying and researching the women's suffrage movement was the reality behind the suffrage movement itself, the reality of what the women had to go through and what the women's ideals and the separation in the group was. I originally thought that the suffrage movement was very united. I thought that all women had the same point of view, that all women wanted all women to be able to vote. This was Mary Church Terrell's beliefs, and that's what I thought. Everyone believed that no matter your skin color, no matter your race, as long as you are a citizen of the United States, you should be able to vote and be part of the government system. But some women believed that only white women should be able to vote. Some women believed women shouldn't be able to vote at all. Some women believed that only white people should be able to be part of the government system, like government officials, part of all that. I also originally thought that it was a generally peaceful protest. I thought it was mostly like marching the streets, doing walks, maybe like sit-ins, lock-ins, and like standing in front of buildings protesting like courthouses and stuff. I learned from researching that these protests could actually get quite violent. For example, the Night of Terror. Many women who were just protesting, doing stuff like that, were seen as going against the law, committing crimes, and many of them were put into jail. One woman, for example, Dora Lewis, was taken to jail. Her head was smashed against her iron bed, and she was knocked unconscious. Her roommate, Alice Kozu, had a heart attack in the middle of the night. Her cellmate, Alice Kozu, had a heart attack in the middle of the night, and she was not given any medical treatment until the next morning. Researching and looking at all of the history and the true natures that these women had to go through made me realize how much they went through and how lucky I am to be where I am now, being able to vote, being able to be part of the government system. And it also really made me realize just how hard it was for them at that time period.
You've all heard about women's suffrage, maybe in your history class, or maybe you did research of your own. But have you really gone in depth with this topic? Women's suffrage is the right for women to vote in elections. It all started around the mid-19th century with a convention held in Seneca Falls, New York of July 19th to 20th, 1848, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met, along with many others. In 1869, they created a new group called the National Women's Suffrage Association, which campaigned for a constitutional amendment for universal suffrage in America, and for other women's rights, such as changes in divorce laws and an end to employment and pay discrimination. This isn't as easy as most people think. These women went through countless cases of suffering throughout almost 70 years of fighting for this right to vote. Some people saw women as less educated at the time, and if women were allowed these rights, they could have been scared that women would overrule. But all these women wanted was to be able to speak out. So let's go back into time a little more. During the early 1800s, the idea of equality became more prominent along with social conditions for women. So they began to change, which led to the birth of the women's suffrage movement. Men were the primary wage earners, while women were expected to be primarily responsible for housework and childcare. Women usually worked in factories or in richer households of the other families to make the most money they can, to be able to support themselves and their family. That doesn't mean men didn't do anything. Men and women both had to support their families, particularly among the poor. They had to do anything to survive. Families more on the richer side, high income of most families, had it a little different. The men, of course, would empower the wife in his household to strictly only make food and cleaning and taking care of the children. There have been countless cases of women wanting to do something about this. They wanted to speak out, to have a voice to stop all this gender empowerment and gender roles. So during the mid-1800s, the women's suffrage movement began. The NWSA, aka the National Women's Suffrage Association, protested multiple times around anywhere they can to really to make a stand. The women that were associated with this group have been treated poorly. They had to be arrested multiple times, but that's really what they wanted. These women were treated horribly in these prison cells, groped, force-fed, and abused. The brave thing about these women, though, is once they would get out of jail, they would go right back to protesting, because these women knew they needed to make a difference, and they knew that they needed to change the world. So after all these years of fighting and suffering, the United States Constitution granted women the right to vote, prohibiting any United States citizen to be denied the right to vote based on sex, which is the Amendment 19.
Women began the process of fighting for their human rights in the 1920s. Up until the 19th Amendment, women were not allowed the right to vote. Men had underestimated the voice and views of a woman and how her actions could speak louder than her words. Women protested and picketed the White House, targeting President Woodrow Wilson. He had promised change, for the better, and to uphold the standards of the human rights. When it came down to the vote, he denied women their human right to be treated as an equal to the rest of their population. In the process of the protests, 10 women were arrested, abused, and denied basic health care. They were speaking their truth and using freedom of speech, another human right as a citizen of the United States. Although I did know about the process of women being given the right to vote, I didn't know how brutal the experience was for these women. They fought for basic human rights, even though it meant they could lose everything. At the end of the day, it was a man's world. Men liked their freedom and the power they had over women. They made up morals that women should have and what they should live by. Women shouldn't be bothered with civic life duties, as they are meant and made to tend to the kitchen and the children. Which was rather odd to me when I found out that in the case of parents divorcing, the husband always gained custody of the children. A woman's job was given to a man. As a woman would travel with her husband, she would never have her name printed on her documents. It would always be the husband's name with the added word wife. This did not change until late 1937. Women were finally able to have a sliver of independence and have their name printed on a legal document. The process and journey for women's rights had just begun. Women were given the ability to own their own property along with managing their own finances. I had never realized what kind of journey these women endured while using their voice and actions to make a change.
What I learned from the women's suffrage movement was that I didn't know as much about it as I thought I did. For example, I had no idea that anything violent happened during this movement. I was shocked after reading about the Night of Terror and how they were brutally beaten, but did not receive any medical attention after this until the next morning, and about how they would go on hunger strikes and they had to be force-fed because of this. I also did not know that not all women were in support of the movement. It was weird to read about how some women were more concerned about losing their role in the home than being able to vote or be a part of the government system. Some women also tended to listen to what their husbands wanted more than what they wanted. This obviously is very different than the world we live in now, which is full of activism for women's rights. I also found that the reasons and excuses they used to explain why women shouldn't vote made no sense. For example, an article written by the National Women's History Museum talks about how men argued that women did not have the mental capacities or expertise to form a valuable opinion about politics. Men were mainly more scared that they would lose their roles in the society to women, and they would have to be the ones at home instead. In my opinion, I found it really fascinating to learn so much about this movement, especially since the activism for women in our generation is so prominent. As I've grown up, I've heard about and seen many protests for women's rights, but nowhere near as violent as they were back then. Ultimately, reading about this, I think, helps us all understand how different things really were, and helps us to really appreciate how lucky we are to have so many rights.
All right, there we go. Should be working. Now, for this project, I wanted to express the suffrage movement through art, because art is something that I am very passionate about. And so through this piece, I tried to represent the many different facets of this movement. While there were very many women who would protest in the street, there was a lot of things that went behind this peaceful protest. There were women who got thrown in jail for protesting for what they believed in. There was the public's ever-shifting view on them. going from, oh, okay, to they're not being patriotic once the war rolled around. But all of this came to its peak when a resignation letter was sent to President Woodrow Wilson by his attorney, so he could leave and represent the suffragettes in court, one of which was his wife. And once the horrors of what these women had endured in prison came out, the public's view once again shifted from the public seeing them as pure evil, not representing their country, not feeling patriotic, to poor innocent women who have been put through such horrors, some of which no one should ever have to deal with.
Experiences that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment, I learned that on August 18th of 1920, the 19th Amendment of the Constitution was ratified. This meant that any U.S. citizen could vote no matter what their gender. Anti-suffragists were against the idea of women voting because of the stereotypes that were placed on women back then. I learned that not all anti-suffragists were men. This was new to me because I didn't know that many upper-class women joined the movement as well. These women argue that politics were dirty business only meant for men, and that women should focus on their duties working in the house. Many people also had other reasons for being opposed to women's suffrage. For example, brewers and distillers were opposed to women voting because they were fearful of them voting for the ban of alcoholic beverages. Business owners also thought that women would vote to eliminate child labor. During this unit, I was surprised to learn about the Night of Terror on November 14th of 1917. During this time, members of the National Women's Party were arrested for protesting their right to vote outside of the White House. These women were terribly mistreated and severely beaten for standing up for themselves. Some even went as far as going on hunger strikes while having to get force-fed in jails. Even though they were extremely violated, they were persistent and kept fighting. Another thing that surprised me was how greatly women were affected by the Expatriation Act, passed by Congress of March of 1907. This law meant that if any American woman was trying to marry a man who was not a U.S. citizen, her citizenship would be taken away. This was not the same for men. If a man married a non-U.S. citizen, she automatically became a U.S. citizen as well. I think this law was only for women because society believed men made more logical decisions back then, so they trusted men to choose who had citizenship, but not women. Learning about all these hard times in women's history made me think about how much I take everything for granted in my daily life.
Hello, I'm going to be giving you the rundown on women's suffrage and how this applied to legal systems. Suffrage is the right to vote, and women in America until 1920 were denied this very right. Many men at the time had beliefs that women were not fit to vote for a couple of reasons. One reason was that they thought that suffrage is not an actual right, and that the privilege may or may not be granted. This was later reflected by the Cable Act, and men at the time also believed that women were bound to the home to take care of children and managing the home. Managing the home, I mean cleaning and doing other various chores. And both men and women thought that the mothers of this country can shape the destinies of the nation by keeping their places and attending to the duties that God Almighty intended for them. Men supported this as change to this would most likely, as they thought, change the destinies, and they thought that it would result in women's suffrage, which many men were against at the time. Many women also believed in this because women thought that certain discoveries, such as using sour milk to remove ink stains, for example, could not be made while not at home. Politics is no place for a woman consensually. The privilege should not be granted to her. Many men believe this because not only do they think they shouldn't have participation in politics, but they also believe that women should not be able to participate in law. I strongly disagree with this because until 1989, women were not allowed to be present on a jury. Men believed women would be deemed unfit to serve due to propter defectum sexus, which would mean a defect of sex. This meant that if a woman as a woman, the right to have a jury of your peers being all women, for example, would be revoked. And more importantly, there are incidents where a man or a woman could receive a reduced sentence due to bias from the jury, whether it be men or women. A jury of any group, male or female, that is biased is a violation to the right of a fair trial. Yet another right taken away due to the incompetence of men and women as a whole on a jury. I believe that the jury system at this point was very corrupt, and at times murderers could get away with a lower sentence due to this bias. Going back a bit now, women had recently gained their suffrage in 1920, after the 19th Amendment's ratification. The Cable Act in 1922, 2 years after that, was soon put into effect. And I'm still very confused and surprised as to why they passed this, but what it does is the act declares that any woman married to a non-US citizen would cause the woman not to become a US citizen anymore. And under certain circumstances, say the woman married someone outside the US who was not a US citizen, they would not become a US citizen, and if they were living outside the country for more than 2 years, she could be denied her naturalization right. So she wouldn't be even able to become a US citizen anymore. Again, I still don't know why they passed this, and I very strongly disagree with this, and it didn't change for another 18 years until 1940, and at that point, women could marry whoever they so chose. Going back to the legal bias in court, some extra information if you want to go on and explore that. A man by the name of Rod Hollier does a very good job on giving raw data to show the biases around the attractiveness of a convicted person and how that can result in reduced sentences, as I was talking about before. As you can see, I didn't cover all of his work, but you can find the rest of it to be in the link down in the page. I found it to be very informative and core to the understanding of the biases in terms of raw numbers, which raw numbers is everything. All right. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you learned something important about women's suffrage, and hopefully you might have changed your viewpoint or something. I don't know, but anyways, thank you for watching.
Women have been fighting for equal rights for a very long time. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. 100 years seems like a long time ago in some eyes, but in reality, it isn't. In fact, 100 years ago is long overdue. Before women got the right to vote in 1920, there were many things they had to overcome. The greatest of these being the views that Congress and the people who opposed the suffrage groups held. In order for change to occur, people had to be persuaded. The views of the majority of the women in this period was what I was most familiar with during this study. The original view of a proper woman, as we all may know, was an uneducated, submissive wife and mother to her kids in the home. Decades before 1920, women started coming together, as they should have. This proper woman stereotype changed when women started seeing relatively equal opinions. I say relatively because some, not all of the women, only wanted white women to be able to vote. Though there were some women that stood with these groups that wanted equality for all races. As I was familiar with the views that women had, I certainly learned a lot more in detail about the unequal citizenship women were given. For example, my classmates and I learned from a source online about the Expatriation Act. The Expatriation Act was an act which said that U.S. women who married a non-citizen would lose her citizenship in the U.S., and if she wanted that citizenship back, her and her husband would have to go through that process again. But none of this applied to an American man when they got married. This is another example of the unequal citizenship that women faced. I found something from one of my own sources online that relates back to the Expatriation Act. Congress believed that women shouldn't be marrying foreigners because they thought they should keep the American women pure. In closing, it is obvious how unequal things for women have always been. In the last 100 years, things have certainly improved for women, but we still have a long way to go.
Women had been fighting for the right to vote for over 100 years. Women did not have this right because they are viewed as someone that should stay in the home and take care of the children in the house. Many people believe that women lack the political knowledge needed to vote, and others believe that women lack the mental capacity to vote. They said they were too emotionally unstable to make logical decisions. Specifically in Alabama, the 19th Amendment was not ratified until September 8th of 1953.
In the decades leading up to the ratification, organizations were formed. This is something that I learned that was specifically interesting. In 1912, the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association, the AESA, was formed. The AESA was made up of many small local groups from around Alabama. These groups eventually realized that they would be more powerful as one large group, which led to the AESA being established. They also allied themselves with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, giving them more power and numbers. Their main goal, just like many others, was securing women's suffrage. However, many of these organizations would only advocate for white women's suffrage. Even though there were many groups that backed women's suffrage, there were also many that were anti-suffrage, meaning they did not support women being allowed to vote or participate in civic activities. Many Alabama men and women supported the Women's Anti-Ratification League. This was a group that believed the family unit would break down and women would no longer take care of the home if they were allowed to take part in civic responsibilities. Finally, in 1953, Alabama showed their support for women's suffrage, and the amendment was ratified, eventually giving women the right to vote.
Thank you to Ms. Lawson and her class for sharing their contributions today. In athletics this week, football returns home Friday night against Westbrook Christian. The game was scheduled to be homecoming, but with our move to level 2, we are moving homecoming to a later date. Tickets will work in much the same way that they have before. Expect an announcement on Thursday regarding student tickets. Swim and Dive gets their competitive season underway Thursday at the Gunnersville Invitational, and volleyball has a pair of home matches Tuesday and Thursday against St. John Paul II and Priceville. In other announcements, opening convocation for seniors will be Thursday at 11:30 a.m. We'll be sending out a special schedule for this. All other students will watch the ceremony live streamed with their advisory. Homecoming week, as we mentioned, has been moved to the week of October 19th through the 24th. More information will come regarding homecoming. Other announcements regarding our transition to level 2. This Wednesday, September 23rd, will be our final independent workday. So similar to level 3, Wednesday you will be at home, not at school, for our last independent workday before we fully make the transition to level 2. Be sure to continue to check in at the front office if you're arriving late or if you're leaving early. That doesn't change in level 2. Also, in terms of free periods, with more students on campus, we're opening up additional free period space. If we do this well, there's a chance that we may even be able to open up other opportunities down the road. For now, Navy students in grades 9 and 10 will go either to the library or to the Commons. Silver students, 11th and 12th graders, will go to the gym lobby or the gym classroom. In both cohorts, we've set aside one of those spaces to be a quieter environment for those looking to get a little extra quiet space to study. For the Navy students, that will be the library, and for the silver students, that will be the classroom. Be sure again to scan in with your QR code to make sure that you're indicated that you're at the table or the desk that you're supposed to be. Again, thank you for all the great work you're doing to make this year a successful year with everything that we have going on. We look forward to this new environment that level 2 will bring us. Be excellent to each other, and seniors, you are dismissed.